Good evening, I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, June 14th. We begin our cast with some big changes to Canada's travel industry. Today, Transport Minister Omar Alghabra announced that the Canadian government will suspend COVID-19 vaccine travel mandates. This for domestic and outbound international travelers and federally regulated workers. The new rules will come into effect on June 20th, though the requirements for foreign nationals coming to Canada will not change. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc warns that the government is prepared to bring back necessary policies if there is a resurgence of the virus in the fall. Travel industry groups have blamed federal public health measures for slowdowns at airport customs, which have contributed to long waits for passengers and forced flight delays and cancellations. Moving to Quebec now, where a group of tech firms is calling on the provincial government to pause Bill 96. The bill requires immigrants to learn French within 6 months of arriving in the province. The companies argue that the time immigrants have before they must use French for official purposes is unrealistic. They say it could do enormous damage to Quebec's economy. The Quebec government estimated last year that 10,000 jobs needed to be filled in the information technology and communication sectors. The World Sikh Organization is calling for an investigation into a false tip that led to the wrongful arrest of 2 organizers of a Sikh rally near Parliament Hill. The organization's president says Canadian law enforcement should fully investigate and prosecute those involved. Tajinder Singh Sidhu says in a statement that the hoax bomb threat in connection to the Sikh rally on Saturday is deeply concerning. The 2 rally organizers say they were wrongfully arrested in connection with a bomb threat which prompted an evacuation of Parliament and the closure of surrounding streets. Turning to the Alberta government now, which is lifting the few pandemic restrictions that remain in place. It says the province is moving past the Omicron wave as hospitalizations steadily decline. The government announced the decision in a news release on Monday. Pandemic measures that will end include mandatory masking on public transit and isolation for people who test positive for COVID-19 or who have symptoms. The government says isolation will still be recommended for those with symptoms or a positive COVID-19 test. Passport offices are still dealing with a surge of applications and long wait times. And one federal minister says this is her top priority. But Karina Gold cannot say when things may return to normal. On Monday afternoon, you could expect to wait 4 hours and 45 minutes at the Ottawa location, 3 hours in Toronto, and 6 hours and 45 minutes in Vancouver. Ms. Gold says her department is considering further changes, including moving the application process online. On the East Coast, the inquiry into the Nova Scotia mass shooting has heard that half of the 911 call takers and dispatchers at the RCMP's Communications Centre are off work. The center's acting commander says there was a full-time staff of 50 people before the massacre in April 2020. Brian Green says there are now just 24 full-time 911 call takers and dispatchers for the provincial RCMP. Mr. Green says most of the job losses are due to Portapique, the town where the killings began. Back in Quebec, a major labor group accuses Amazon of using posters and text messages to interfere with the unionization drive in Montreal. The group says anti-union messaging is omnipresent at the Amazon warehouse in Montreal. A spokesperson for Amazon Canada says the company doesn't think unions are the best answer for its employees. Hundreds of thousands of high school students in Canada will be given training on how to respond to someone overdosing on opioids. A new training program from the Advanced Coronary Treatment Foundation will show students how to administer naloxone, a drug used to reverse the effects of overdoses. It will be added to the CPR and AED training that it offers for free in high schools across the country. The training will first be deployed in Quebec, Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia before expanding to other provinces. A 1.3 square kilometer island has been a prickly issue between Canada and Denmark for years now, but both sides are poised to set aside the dispute over who has ownership over the Arctic landmass near Ellesmere Island. Northern Affairs Minister Dan Vandal says following lengthy discussions over Hans Island, it will have a territorial line drawn across it. That means Canada will now share a land border with Denmark for the first time. The dispute saw both countries raise their flags and leave bottles of domestic spirits for the other on the island. Up next, a look at the looming bear market with Saijal Patel, financial analyst, consultant, and host of Strictly Money. Stay tuned. And of course, we'll have more news from around the world after that. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily. Wall Street is back in the claws of a bear market. This comes as worries about inflation and higher interest rates overwhelm investors. The Federal Reserve has signaled it will aggressively raise interest rates to try to control inflation, which is the highest in decades. Add to that the war in Ukraine and a slowdown in China's economy, and investors have been forced to reconsider what they're willing to pay for a wide range of stocks, from high-flying tech companies to traditional automakers. On Monday, the S&P 500 fell 3.9% and closed nearly 22% below its January 3rd high. With us to unpack the looming bear market is Ms. Saijal Patel, financial analyst, consultant, and host of Strictly Money. She joins us now. Saijal, welcome to Forum Daily.
Nice to see you, Nima.
So for our viewers who may not be familiar with this term, can you unpack bear market for our viewers?
Sure. So when a stock market is considered to be in bear market territory when it is down 20% or more from its recently hit high, right? So if you look at a couple of markets, the S&P 500 in the US, and we look at the US markets because it is the world's largest capital market, the S&P 500 is down about 20% from its recent peak hit in January. If you look at the NASDAQ, which of course follows the big tech heavyweights like your Facebook or Meta or Alphabet, which is the parent of Google, as well as Amazon, that market is down 30% from its last peak, which was hit in November of last year. Now, the TSX composite index here in Canada, we're not in bear market territory, at least not yet. It's down about 10%. And part of the reason there is because it is heavily weighted towards resources and oil. And we know that oil prices are up. So it's lending a little bit of support for that market.
Good to know that things are a little smoother here in Canada. Now, a lot of attention is on the U.S. Federal Reserve's moves to raise interest rates. So how do such decisions from the Fed impact global markets?
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve and the interest rates, I guess the big concern is that interest rates are going up and likely going even higher, right? And the reason for that, Nima, not just in the US and Canada, but frankly, most markets around the world, is there's hope that higher interest rates will tame up runaway prices and inflation and bring it back to reasonable levels. The complication with that, there's a couple of things. One, it hasn't worked, at least not yet, right? If you look at recent numbers out of Canada and the US, the trajectory is still higher. In fact, in the US, we got numbers north of 8% last week, and there was hope that it had peaked, and it means that the Federal Reserve is taking a more aggressive stance. Now, we are going into a two-day policy meeting in the US tomorrow. 50 basis point hike is pretty much baked in, but there's a lot of people saying that we could see a 75 basis point hike. I happen to be in that camp because just because of the tone that we're seeing. The last comment that I would make about the markets and what's really getting them nervous is that typically interest rates would work, right? The idea is that it tames demand down. The problem is that this is not just a demand-driven inflation. A lot of it has to do with supply disruptions. As you talked about, right, in China, you've got hundreds of thousands of cargo ships sitting there. The Russian-Ukraine conflict is affecting oil prices, and that's a disruption. So there's still a verdict out there of whether these interest rate hikes are going to work. The only thing is the central bank's policy or mandate is to use interest rates. So that's the toolbox that they use, and that's what they're doing.
All right, Saijal, about a minute left here, but are there any ways that investors can prepare for a bear market? Are there any particular investments to consider at this time? I know there's a lot of interest around cryptocurrencies right now.
Yeah, so what I would say is try to gain some perspective, right? we've had 14 bear markets since World War II. I've been in the financial industry for 20 years. I've seen at least 7 in my days. And while we see market corrections, we also see market rebounds. So unless you need the money right now, don't sell. Right? It's easy to look at your portfolio and see that it's down, but it's just a number. You haven't realized it unless you sell. Remember that the stock market is a longer term game and we should see a recovery. We just don't know when it's going to happen. And for those who are looking at the markets, again, you can't time the bottom. We don't know when the bottom is going to happen. So a couple of good strategies. Dollar cost average in, right? If you're looking at low cost index funds or ETFs or mutual funds, if you want to be more active, go more defensive, right? Defensive plays that do well regardless of the economy. That should help as well.
The federal government is cutting short debate by MPs of its online streaming bill. This in a move that Tories are condemning as draconian and disturbing. They say curbing scrutiny of the bill line by line in committee is a Liberal attempt to rush it through the Commons and will lead to the creation of a flawed law. Bill C-11, as it is known in Parliament, updates Canada's broadcasting laws and would regulate streaming services such as Netflix, as well as YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper insight into Bill C-11 and the way it's being passed through Parliament is Peter Menzies, former Vice Chairman of the CRTC and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Mr. Menzies, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So what powers does this bill give to the CRTC and what platforms will be impacted?
It gives the CRTC an immense amount of power. It actually gives the CRTC authority over the entire internet, globally, not just in Canada, which is breathtaking in scope. The purpose of it is, according to the government, to make sure that streaming companies in Canada are reinvesting in Canada if they're enjoying the system, that they get something, that they pay into the system. But it's far more complicated than that. They're getting into areas where they're going to tell you what you should be watching or promoting Canadian content above your preferred content online on Netflix and that sort of area, and opens all kinds of doors for further regulation, including social media posts.
And what sort of impact would this bill have on content creators on such platforms?
I think it will have a very devastating, could have, depending on how the CRTC implements it. I don't want to understate the danger, but I don't want to overstate the impact and make YouTube content creators more nervous than they have to be, because there's a process that has to unfold. And hopefully, eventually, the CRTC will hear their voices. But there are 100,000 Canadians who make some kind of money as YouTube content creators, and there's about 25 to 30,000 of them for whom it's their full-time job, and it would have a big impact on them. They are a very concerned group of people right now.
So what does this mean for freedom of expression for these content creators on these platforms?
Well, what it does is it suppresses their expression in favor of government approved expression, if you want to put it that way. So if you are licensed and you're getting your money from a government fund, if you are a certified Canadian content provider, in other words, you meet all the standards required by the CRTC as a government agency to qualify for that, then your content will be, the idea behind it is that YouTube and others would then have to promote your content ahead of that from unapproved Canadian content creators, because there'd be two classes basically, and the government approved and the ungovernment approved, and that obviously has a big impact on your freedom of expression. That you have to be government approved. Government approved gets preferred over non-government preferred.
So we've been seeing a lot of concern around this from content creators, but also MPs, opposing MPs to the Liberals' plan, especially when it comes to expediting the process of passing this bill. So what kind of concerns have been brought up by MPs so far?
Well, I mean, one of the concerns when you go through these things is the opportunity to go through it line by line and consider amendments, because even good governments and bad governments and governments with the best intentions and government with the bad don't necessarily get the language correct, don't necessarily understand the unintended consequences of some of the language in the bills. So by skipping through this line-by-line process, which the government is trying to sort of give a giddy up on through procedural maneuvering, we miss that opportunity. And then, of course, there are amendments that are recommended by other outside groups, like, say, the Internet Society of Canada, or even by major groups like Google and Netflix, or Apple or whatever, that they're going to review in secret. So we'll never know what the proposed amendments were unless they get adopted, right? That's inappropriate. It's demeaning to the democratic process, and it's frankly unnecessary. It makes the government, and I can't understand why they'd be comfortable with this. There is no rush, but it makes them look like thugs.
A lot to keep our eyes on, Mr. Menzies. We are out of time, but we'll have to get you back on the show to talk about this more, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for the time. Enjoy the day.
We'll be right back, and we've got more news from around the world, so stay tuned. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced a planned visit to Saudi Arabia next month, and the U.K. reaches an agreement to send people who enter the country illegally to Rwanda. These stories and more top international headlines coming up shortly on Forum Daily. We'll be right back. U.S. President Joe Biden says he'll visit Saudi Arabia next month. And it's a dramatic shift from Mr. Biden's pledge as a presidential candidate to make Saudi Arabia a pariah. The visit will come at the tail end of a mid-July trip, which will also include stops in Israel and the West Bank. Mr. Biden is looking to reset the U.S.-Saudi relationship. This comes at a time when the U.S. could use a little help from the oil-rich kingdom to alleviate soaring gas prices. Moving to the United Kingdom now, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is responding to pushback on his plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. He says opponents of his plan are, quote, abetting the work of criminal gangs. Mr. Johnson's government has reached an agreement with Rwanda to send people who enter the UK illegally to the East African country. The policy has faced a series of legal challenges and sparked heated debate across the kingdom. In war-torn Ukraine, a regional governor says the eastern city of Severodonetsk is not yet blocked off by Russian troops. Still, the governor acknowledges that Russian forces control about 80% of the city and have destroyed all 3 bridges leading out of it. The governor of the Luhansk region says Ukrainian forces are still able to evacuate their wounded and communicate with their troops. But he says the mass evacuation of civilians now is simply not possible. This is due to the relentless shelling and fighting in the city. Meanwhile, the United Nations addresses tribal clashes over the past week in Sudan's Darfur region. It says the death toll from the violence has reached at least 125. It erupted following a land dispute between Arab and African tribes in the town of Kulbus in West Darfur province. Local Arab militias then attacked multiple villages in the area. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said Tuesday that the dead included over 100 from the African Gamir tribe and 25 Arabs. Turning to South Korea now, where unionized truckers have ended an 8-day strike. Thousands of truckers joined the nationwide strike, which caused major disruptions to domestic production and cargo transport. They were calling for an extension of temporary guarantees of minimum wages amid soaring fuel prices. Representatives of the striking truckers and transport ministry officials reached a deal on Tuesday night on ending the strike. They say the ministry agreed to seek to extend current rules on minimum wage guarantees, and they will consider increasing fuel subsidies for truckers. The truckers' union says the drivers will immediately return to work. European lawmakers from 2 committees objected Tuesday to including gas and nuclear in the EU's list of sustainable activities. The European Commission earlier this year proposed including nuclear energy and natural gas in its plans for building a climate-friendly future. This divided member countries and caused outcry from environmentalists as greenwashing. The resolution will now be examined by the whole EU Parliament next month. The Commission will need to withdraw or amend its regulation if an absolute majority of lawmakers oppose it. Monkeypox continues to spread around the world, and the World Health Organization is acting on it. It will convene an emergency committee of experts to determine if the expanding monkeypox outbreak should be considered a global health emergency. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus says the virus has shown unusual behavior recently. Declaring monkeypox to be an international health emergency would give it the same designation as the COVID-19 pandemic. The UK says it has 470 cases of monkeypox across the country, while Canada has had at least 112. The area burnt by wildfires in the western United States this year is already double the national 10-year average. Blazes broke out early this spring in several western states. This comes as climate change and drought are increasing the frequency and intensity of forest and grassland fires. States like New Mexico have already set records with devastating blazes that destroyed hundreds of homes. Barcelona will promote the UN Refugee Agency's logo on the back of its jerseys for the next 4 seasons. The agreement comes after the UNHCR recently said an unprecedented 100 million people had been forced to flee conflict, violence, human rights violations, and persecution. This is propelled by the war in Ukraine and other deadly conflicts. Barcelona handed over sponsorship space on its jerseys to the UNHCR rather than selling to a commercial entity. This despite the club having a debt of $1.3 billion. While the UNHCR logo will be on the reverse of Barcelona's jerseys, the front will feature audio streaming platform Spotify. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.